Domestic workers have been part of my life for as long as I can remember. I was 2 when my mother went back to work and Marie Fedek came to care for me. Marie didn't coo, she didn't gush, she didn't sugarcoat. Her manner was rough, matter-of-fact, sometimes fierce. I always knew that she was completely devoted to me, and I adored her. In retrospect now, I'm aware of how many things I didn't know about Marie. Over the years, I learned that her family had come to America from Poland and that she had grown up in an orphanage. Marie cared for me until I started kindergarten. Then she married and left to start her own family. Fast forward 25 years. My son, Peter, is 18 months old, and I am thinking about going back to work part-time. Chatting with some neighbors at the mailbox, one of them mentioned Etta Clark, who had been caring for families in New York for 20 years. She was then looking for part-time work. Etta was very aware of the funny side of life. Peter was too. For 7 years, they cracked each other up. We taught her about gefilte fish. She taught us about aki with rice. Etta worked with us until, now this is a digression, but it's a pretty good one. One day she won the New Jersey State Lottery. Not the millions of dollars mega lottery. She won the smaller one, only a couple of $100,000. Etta finished out the month with us. Bought an apartment house in the Bronx and moved to Miami. Fast forward again. Everyone is getting older. Peter is grown up and married. Every other Wednesday, Dalia Hernandez, who moved here from Santo Domingo 5 years ago, comes to clean our apartment. On the alternate Wednesdays, Dalia cleans my mother-in-law's small apartment not far from ours. My mother-in-law, Clara Felsenfeld, called Nanny by everyone in our family, is 94 and is completely self-sufficient. She shops, pays her bills, balances her checkbook, takes the bus to the beauty parlor, meets her friends for lunch. Then Nanny is almost completely self-sufficient most of the time. On windy days, she needs help walking to the supermarket. Getting out of the bathtub is a problem, as is waiting for a bus. We, her family, and she are holding our breaths. We are worried sick about 1,000 things. Would she agree to move in with one of us? Would that work? Would there be enough money to pay for someone to be there in her apartment to help her? Where would we find someone with a breadth of vision to understand Nanny's enormous personal pride, her independence? This woman has lived alone for 30 years since her husband died. What would it be like for her to share her home, to be dependent? Well, it worked out. Jocelyn Thomas entered the picture. Luckily, Jocelyn's schedule allowed her to be flexible at the beginning, a couple of days a week. That eventually became full-time. As Nanny relaxed and began to feel safe, as she allowed herself to be cared for, a real respect developed between those two women. Nanny lived for another 5 years, to 99. And Jocelyn became the person who knew her, who could best read her body and her spirit. On the last morning, it was not a doctor and it was not another family member. It was Jocelyn who called to suggest that we come over. She sensed that something was changing. In June 2004, my friend Carol invited a few of us to her home to hear about what she called domestic workers' rights in Shalom Bayit. My first response was to thank Carol and decline. There are an awful lot of things to do on any given night. But something made me pause. I remember thinking about it on the crosstown bus on the way to Carol's that night. What struck me was some vague discomfort that I was not completely aware of, and some sense that I've had that feeling for a long time. That the decisions I and my husband had been making for years about salaries and vacations and sick days and overtime and on were good-hearted, and they sprang from basic, decent instincts. But we were winging it. We were making it up as we went along, based on mailbox conversations, on chatter at preschool meetings, on quick phone calls. So I went to Carol's that evening, and there I met Danielle Ferris, who is a force of nature. And discovered that this vague, unformed feeling that I'd had was shared by other employers, and that they were beginning to talk about it. This was my first experience as an employer for justice, and it was powerful. And I learned that also, and most important, many hundreds of domestic workers in New York, out of their shared experiences of exploitation and abuse, had come together to tell their stories and had formed Domestic Workers United. By the end of that evening at Carol's, I had committed myself to hosting a living room gathering sometime after the summer. I was not completely sure what I was getting myself into, but this was June, after the summer was many months away, and surely Danielle would have forgotten about our This began a new chapter in my story of increasing awareness of domestic workers' issues, of JFREG, of Employers for Justice, of the amazing and increasingly powerful work of Domestic Workers United. 3 years ago, domestic workers' rights became a major focus at my synagogue, B'nai Jeshurun, which has historically concerned itself with tikkun olam and social action. From that, a B'nai Jeshurun Employers for Justice network was formed. When it began, our goal was to sign up 30 households. We signed up 34. Now, in the past few months, another new chevra has evolved, concerned with aging in New York. Our last meeting was literally standing room only. And let me say here, parenthetically, that of the 24 people at that meeting, 23 were women. For sure, aging is a feminist issue. At that meeting last week, we laid the groundwork for a series of community lectures to begin in January on different aspects of aging in New York, and there is a strong possibility that we will be partnering with Caring Across Generations. These stories that I've shared today have happy endings. They're optimistic, positive stories, middle-class stories with options and privileges. I'm very well aware of that. Our job today is to continue building trust and community between caregivers and the families who do and who will depend on them. To build a movement in which caregivers, elders, people with disabilities, every one of us working together, transform long-term care. Our job is to make happy endings the standard, the norm, not the